service folks knew that AmeriCorps was going to be cut, and the electoral reform folks knew that election reform grants are being cut, and on and on. And I was at several meetings. One of them, I think you were at the No Free Lunch Caucus meeting, where I was kind of saying, so what are the transparency folks concerned with here? And the response I kept getting was, well, we're not really sure. And so I guess I'm wondering why that was the case, or if anything has changed now that will make it easier for y'all to know what things are threatened, or I don't know if there's anything you can say to that. Or
do you want to say that? I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. Yeah. So one thing that I will say is that, and Daniel can speak more to this on a sort of more congressional political level. In terms of an organizing level, to be frank, transparency programs tend to have a lot more bipartisan support than almost any other programs, and so the alarm bell goes off later for us than for other folks, just based on that alone. If you are in a different advocacy place, you know, pretty much everybody in Congress, you know where they stand on your issue, and something like a transparency program is a little bit different. You know, we're talking about a program that was co-sponsored, you know, for one of these things by Barack Obama and Tom Coburn. I mean, those are, you know, not folks that people on either side of the respective aisles, you know. So there was that, and the second thing was that, honestly, this was a really great campaign for us to run. And part of it was that I wasn't totally sure that we would get a lot of response around it, because people weren't really worried about it, until actually there was a conversation that happened on the open house list where, which is a Google group for the purposes of streaming that Sunlight, that is somewhat managed by Sunlight, but it is an open Google group for anybody to talk about policy. There was a conversation that happened on this Google group that involved folks who are sort of, you know, everyone from a Democratic campaign activist to a guy who does social media for the Tea Party. And they all were like, this is the dumbest thing ever. Why is this happening? And it sort of actually took that independent conversation for me to think that it would be a successful campaign. We started it as a campaign as soon as I realized that there would actually be political support behind it and people would do something even as small as sign a petition. And it turns out that they did a lot more, and they, you know, wrote, you know, all kinds of stuff in the press about it and wrote letters to their editor and called. And there wound up being a lot more activity than we initially thought, but it took sort of seeing some more independent voices yelling about it from other places for me to think that anybody actually cared.
Right, though in part my question was, I mean, I'm very appreciative of what you did. My question is, it seemed like nobody even knew that there was a problem.
Daniel did.
Yeah, so...
We did. Well, from my perspective, we did. We just didn't know that anything we would do would be effective or that people would care if we said something about it.
And the truth is, the community should figure this out a lot sooner. Sunlight's policy shop is tiny. I mean, there's like 2.5 of us, and none of us are budget wonks. You know, I'm really good at taking apart legislation, but I'm not an expert in the budget process. So, at least for me, there was a combination of there's bipartisan agreement on these programs and that seemed not inconceivable, but just really odd that this would come in for anything more than at most like a minor attack. You know, Vivek Kundra came out saying that the cloud computing, you know, over the next couple of years is going to save $3 billion, and they're putting, you know, pennies towards it through the eGov fund. You know, where there was a quote, I forget who it was from now, talking about, you know, the cuts being penny wise and pound foolish. You know, from a cost savings point of view, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But there's a question of were the appropriators even aware of that? You know,
I wondered, like, did Vivek know that his programs were threatened? You know.
Well, so there's different pieces. So the question is, did the House know it? Did the people in the House who were doing this know what was going on, know what the score was? And I don't think they did. But
maybe a short question, but can you talk about what you did to research where the cut came from, or Like how do we know what happened? If we know it.
Yeah, so we don't know what happened. And I mean, the legislative process in some respects is, as I mean, you know better than anyone, it's like this black box where we often don't know what the inputs now, you know what the outputs, but you don't know what the inputs are. You don't know why things are happening in a certain kind of way. We should have looked at the House budget when it first came out. I mean, everybody knew that the House budget that came out was a non-starter, right? It was never going to go anyplace. And the Senate budget was also a non-starter. And the President's budget, you know, they're all sort of, none of them mean anything, right? They're not actually going to go anywhere because they have to go through this process of fighting things out. And it's a miserable thing to look through. It's hard to find. The eGov fund is not broken down or well described in the budget. So for me, it was a matter of building on 2 years of like learning about how the budget, certain aspects of the budget process work, to be able to find the different pieces to put everything together, say, oh, okay, the eGov fund is being cut, and the eGov funds all of these things, and even then I wasn't able, and then this is how much they give to each thing, and that wasn't, you know, as accurate as it could be, but wasn't right on, and then continuing to write about it, and then starting to get feedback from inside the government that helped give me more information, so I could fine-tune the information that I was giving to folks out there. I don't know why this wasn't on our radar screen, so that's why we didn't pay attention to it. That's not really the space that Sunlight operates in, so it's a little bit. I wouldn't want to say it's not our thing because it is our thing. I mean, I spend and continue to spend a lot of time on it, but it wasn't our primary focus. It isn't our primary focus. There are a lot of more traditional organizations. I'm surprised that they didn't see it, but it's not. You know, I'm not pointing fingers at them for failing to see it. It was surprising that these cuts were taking place at all, and that a lot of the legislators who have a very good reason to know that this is going on did not know. On the executive side, when the president engaged in budget negotiations, there's only a couple of people who are allowed to speak about this. So I have no way of saying whether Vivek is on or is not on the budget team. But since he wasn't able to comment, what seems most likely to me is that he was not in a position to comment that if, at least in other administrations, when people talk about the budget when they're not supposed to, they get fired. So I don't know if that was what was going on in this situation. There's no way that I could know the answer to that question. But that, you know, it seems likely that he would not be in a position where he could communicate that to the communities that were, you know, that would be involved and interested. So some of it for us, you know, is okay. We've identified the eGov fund. They've got a bunch of programs under there. What are the other funds? What are the other sources that pay for the things that we care about? What are the other things that we care about? You know, that, you know, trying to, you know, we can look at FFATA and USA spending, and we can look at these other things. But what are the other, you know, as we're beginning to start to coalesce as more than a group of elites, which is what, unfortunately, the transparency movement has been in certain ways, where it's more and more people paying attention, able to exercise more and more political muscle, and doing what Nicole is helping to do, which is to get the folks organized. We can play a different kind of role in the policy base. Before it was providing expertise. How do you draft this law? What is something that you should focus on? How do you attend to these kinds of issues, as opposed to the more traditional role that special interests, which is what we are looking at becoming to some extent. Not we Sunlight, but we as a movement. You know, are there data programs that are particularly useful that we need to focus on? Are there things that are of interest to our community that's not of interest to other communities, or at least that they may not realize that they're interested in, that we need to build coalitions around? It's a very different conceptualization of who we are and what we do. You know, Sunlight, for example, and I think many of the people in this room, we're very technocratic. You know, you make merit-based decisions, and you look at all the facts, and, you know, it's not about all these other kinds of things. It's about, you know, you just bring information to those who need it, and then the right things will happen, as opposed to getting 100 people to call a particularly relevant member of Congress and say, this is something that's important to us. And whether we want to make that transition, all of us, how we want to make that transition, how we demonstrate the benefits of of what we care about as being relevant to the American people or a large subset of them? These are all really, really difficult questions. And it's certainly not something that we can sort of answer, in the next 40 minutes or whatever it is. What we can, I think, look at a little bit is, what are the things that we really care about? How would we like to see the government change to give us the information that is useful and helpful to us? I mean, I know you've got some suggestions in terms of communications and legislative data. I know that we all have sort of ideas, but what are the things that are worth the time to make the arguments about, that's worth the time to fundraise, to have policy people paying attention to, as well as devoting time for the budget questions. From now on, should I spend 20% of my time keeping an eye on how the budget is developing? Is this a reasonable use of sunlight time to do something along those lines? And if not us, who are the right people to do that? Is that something that we can crowdsource and encourage people to do? Is that something that we can build a tool for, that alarm bells will start to go off when there's a cut here? Is the maintaining of things at current levels sufficient for where we need to grow things? Okay, so we've got an $8 million funding level for the rest of this year. Arguably, it's probably going to have to last the next 6 to 12 months, since it's really unlikely that a budget's going to be passed for the 1st of October. Is $6 million? What's the consequences of having what is effectively $6 million left for the next year? Is data.gov going to be lobotomized in certain kinds of ways? Is USA spending going to fail to grow to meet the needs that we all have? Are we using the right language to talk about these things? I don't have answers.
It seems like if it's not if somebody else is not going to step up to play that watchdog role and lead this conversation, then it's going to have to be sunlight, right? If Open the Government or OMB Watch or POGO or somebody else doesn't want to do it, then I mean, I think when it comes down to it, I don't know who else it would be. I would think, and that may not be a natural fit. And if it doesn't feel like the right fit, it seems like you guys need to be able to kind of take the initiative to broker the conversation with the other groups to say, if somebody else isn't going to step up, then we need to create the entity that's going to do that work, right? Because otherwise, who's watching who's watching it, right? I think that everybody is.
I think that everybody is interested. One thing that's of interest is, how do we? This is not going to sound right, but how do we as a community organize ourselves? It's how does OMB Watch and POGO and Sunlight and the other folks talk to one another in such a way as to divide up resources and divide up attention, saying you're going to do this and you're going to do that. I mean, because to have everybody doing everything all the time is also, doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right, and it seems like a lot of fields, this is just going to get really annoying. Yeah. I mean, it seems like a lot of fields, it's the creation of a table, right? And somebody serves as the broker of that table, and we're going to have a very honest discussion about who's going to focus on what. And we all agree, here are the 10 things that need to get done, and we're going to parcel out who's going to do them. And if nobody's stepping up, or if there's a conflict, we've either got a funder or somebody else that's going to arbitrate this and figure out who's going to fill that hole, right? And
there's also just the wider, right? There's also just the wider movement, right, of people. And I feel, well, I'm very busy, but I'd like to be mobilized every now and then to do something that's a little bit part of a greater mission besides my project.
Of course, at the Urban Institute, we're a nonpartisan organization, so we can't lobby for or against anything or get involved in advocacy campaigns. But my previous job, I was working for a national advocacy group that worked with both local partners around the country and also other national advocacy groups, including one called the Coalition on Human Needs, which is a staff of 2.5 people total, that addressed all human needs. And, yeah, it's all done. So we partnered with them and some other national organizations, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and it's awkward at times because sometimes they have different priorities than we do, or we when I was them. But I think that is what it takes. I think there need to be more partnerships between, and I don't know what you're already doing, but between Sunlight and BOGO and OMB Watch and what was it, the Center for American Progress, I think that has open secrets.
Irish American Scientists.
Okay, got the wrong, American something.
Yeah.
But I think there does need to be a coalition effort because, like you just said, it's sort of duplicative for everybody to be engaging in their own campaigns instead of coordinating campaign.
Yeah. Do you guys want to jump in?
So I just want to say that I have saved all of the data. All of the data is safe. There's no need to worry. No cause of alarm. We're good.
So I think if there's some way to allow people to subscribe to changes for a given subset of the budget, many people would love to do that, and that solves part of the problem. But then what do you do with brand new parts of the budget that didn't exist before? Someone has to actually categorize them. And what happens if, say, a part of the budget changes name, the office is still funded at the same amount, but it's now a different part of the budget, or it's a different name, or whatever. Will the computer keep track of that?
That's a great question. So I can tell you what we're doing.
Sure.
She's not in the room right now, but I have an intern. No, she's not an intern anymore. She's now a graduate fellow. And what she does every day is when bills are introduced in Congress, she keeps track of them, and she literally goes through them by hand, identifies the ones that are relevant for transparency issues. And I get a notice every day from some folks who built a great tool to monitor the Federal Register for certain types of rules that come out. And we try to monitor news stories that exist as well on these kinds of things. We're not really built well to do those kinds of things. I mean, we're running it through, former interns and now a graduate fellow to pay attention to these kinds of things. When I've worked at other organizations or when I worked for the government, there was much more of a comprehensive way to do these kinds of things. So the question, is this a tool question? Is this something that we can build for ourselves and for everyone else? Or help my role is not to build things, right? It's to liberate the information so that whether it's people in Sunlight Labs or other folks can build things with them. So is the information out there in such a way that we can build things smarter? Is that even the right approach? Is it investing in human resources instead to do those kinds of things? I do know that I've made a deliberate effort, we've made a deliberate effort to publish the results of our work online. So every day you can see, today, it was called Today in Transparency, we just changed the name. Today in OpenGov, which we published on the Sunlight blog, and before it was on the blog, it was on another blog that we have, where it's a roundup of all the news news stories from the previous day that are transparency related, combined with all the bills that are relevant and the hearings that are relevant for that week in Congress. It's not ideal, but it is a way of trying to organize the community, to share information. A couple of years ago, there was the Open House Project. It has the Open House Project Google group, which is another way where people can share information, and sometimes it's very active and sometimes it's much more dormant. I'm very hesitant to do things like sending the day in, I still want to call it the day in transparency, the day in open data to the list, because I don't want to feel like people are getting spammed or things like that. But that may be one way to continue to, raise awareness of what's going on. Yeah.
So just thinking about, the coalition and its size and like what it looks like and what it is, I think it's hard to imagine a coalition extending for long periods of time to one interest or another, because transparency is really a tool, sort of like market mechanisms or regulations. And what's unique about it is it's a tool that's significantly underused, and so there's this community that wants, it to be considered as opposed to a market mechanism or a regulation, because it's really successful the majority of the time. But the coalition for that is shifting because, and awkwardly so, normally the party out of power is more in favor than the party in power. And I think that in tracking legislation, that needs to be part of the mindset, is that your supporter one day might not be your supporter the next day, because they don't really necessarily care about the transparency as much as we do. What they care about is how that transparency can potentially make the other guy look bad, or give consumers the information to make the choice that I want them to make. And so I think that the coalition really needs to look at where the most progress can be made based on the existing coalitions, and to push then for consistency in how transparency is applied. So like, we might disagree about what transparency should be applied on, but I think we might all agree about what type of format, open document formats need to be used, that it needs to be online, that there are all sorts of substantive pieces that should become, I think, more of a doctrine, while the actual focus or what matters, this month versus next month should shift.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I was at the media reform conference in Boston last month, and very similar kind of conversation going on there. And right, the quote is, media reform isn't probably most people's top priority, but hopefully we can make it their second priority. Their means to get whatever they want to get, and that whether you care about campaign finance reform or media reform or transparency, all of this is about getting to other constituencies to convey why they should care about this stuff in order to get those other things they care about. And that seems to me like the big conversation that needs to be focused on. And I think you're absolutely right that based on where the politics lie, there are going to be different arguments that can be made to different constituencies. And right now, there's an opportunity to bring along different folks that 4 years from now we might not be able to bring along, or and vice versa. I think that's really interesting.
There's, so we've got the possibility of these sort of meta coalitions, right, where people you really care about healthcare, or you really care about healthcare reform, and that's a way of, and you can work with the coalition. People really care a lot about that to put transparency into what's going on, whatever healthcare reforms are going to be enacted. It becomes sort of an organizing and awareness kind of question and issue. One thing that also is in the last couple of years, we've seen a very unsettled political system. The Democrats took control of the House in 2006 after a number of years of being out of power, and they vowed to make a number of reforms. And they did. They made a number of reforms, including the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act and some other things. And then after 2.5 years in, even if the desire was there, the will to do some of those reforms started to diminish. And this is not a knock against the House Democrats. This is the nature of being in power, that your desires start to give way to practical political situation. We're seeing the same thing with President Obama, where he came in, be most transparent ever, has an initiative the first day that he's in office, this memo that goes out, the Open Government Directive, and now we see a focus on international transparency, which is very important, but international transparency is not domestic transparency. It's not what we were talking about a year and a half ago. And the officials that are working on these things are not the same people who were there before. Right now we have an ascendant House Republican leadership who care seriously and deeply, surprisingly to some folks, unsurprising to others, about these issues, and have made serious efforts at reform. They've changed the House rules in ways that are real. They really, the Speaker and the Majority Leader wrote a letter on Friday that talks about putting all legislative information available in XML, directing the clerk to figure out how to do this. This isn't someone shouting in the wilderness, oh, you need to do this or that. This is someone who has power saying that this will get done. Whether this is going to be true in a year or 2 or 3, if the same folks stay in power, is a different question. But we can see right now House Republicans are really into this. The president and his folks are somewhat into this, and the Senate is much less into this, and the courts couldn't care less about any of these issues. And it's reflecting the nature of the political branches. It's just what they are and where things are changing over. We have these limited windows of opportunity that arise. We saw it in '94 when the House and the Senate, when Gingrich was in power. We saw it a little bit in 2000, although the Bush administration had no interest in transparency whatsoever. We saw this in 2006 and in 2008, and now. How do we take those who are sincere advocates for these issues while they still have the political winds behind them to move to the next step? Before the Obama administration gives up on the Open Government Directive, or they're no longer in power, or people have changed over, or it's too hard, or they've got 3 wars that they're fighting and some other things that are more pressing. Procedure is never going to be that interesting to folks, except for those who've been harmed by bad procedure in the past. And as the memory of those hurts fades, their will fades. So how do we use that? I don't know. And I apologize if it sounds...
Do we have time? Can I ramble for a minute?
Yes, please.
I've already solved it, but I haven't told you the answer yet. I read an interesting book called Stealth Democracy that actually argues that what people really care about is not so much issues. They care about issues, but also process and corruption, sort of generally, right? And that. So I'm not sure how to square that away with reality, where it doesn't appear like anyone actually cares, right? We seem to mostly be interested in voting on issues and not voting on corruption, even though we sort of do that too when it comes up from time to time. But the moral of the story of the book was something like people don't want to be involved in politics like actually reading bills and voting themselves, right? We want to elect people to do the government stuff for us, but we really care that they do it in a way that's fair and responsible. So I think that this ought to be important, not ought in the sense that like people should care about this stuff, but like it's epistemic ought. Sorry, I'm a linguist. It's like I have no idea how to say what I'm saying. People do care, and we ought to be able to recognize that people do care about process.
So how do we identify how they care? I mean, so I was thinking one way that we identify how people care.
You'll have to start over.
So one way that we can identify how people care is when they do stuff with it. When someone builds GovTrack, it's not because, it's because they care about, they're trying to solve a problem. It's because they care about it. When you see someone using data.gov to answer a question, it's because they care in some kind of way. Is maybe that we need to do a better job of identifying how people are using this information? Is that the way that we can say, look, someone cares so much about the Federal Register, they built a tool that will let you know what's going on in the Federal Register. It's that important to them, and it's so important to them not just that it exists, because they're a private sector knowledge, but that it's opened up in a way that everybody can use. Maybe that's the way. But then, how do we organize ourselves as a community to identify those things? You don't just want to have it residing in a couple of random brains, across the country. Oh, well, these 6 things exist. I mean, we had this conversation in another panel today. How do we how do we demonstrate, how do we find the actions that people are taking? Wikipedia is easy, right? I mean, if you want to see why people care about Wikipedia, you go to Wikipedia, and it's ubiquitous and it covers like, most of the world's knowledge. Is it time?
Just about 5.
Okay.
We have a few announcements too. At 6 o'clock, we're having happy hour at Rocket Bar. It's off the Gallery Place Chinatown Metro stop. The address is up on the television screens right out here. First 200 drinks are free, and we have free barbecue, both meat and vegetarian. So
At the bar?
at the bar, yes. It's also being catered by one of the DC food trucks. So, and then tomorrow morning we have breakfast at 9, and then sessions start at 10. So if you have any sessions you'd like to put up on the board, the earlier the better. So.
Will that start tomorrow, putting stuff on the board?
Yeah, that starts tomorrow night. You can start.
Is there a closing session?
Not today. Tomorrow there will be. Yeah.
I think it's at 4 to 4:30 is the closing session tomorrow.
Is that?
4 to 4:30 is the closing session tomorrow.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got the shirt on, so I should know. But the meeting was like 4:30 on Friday, and my attention to that was not as great as it should have been. I think it's. I mean, I don't have any closing comments or anything. Does anybody want to say anything before we? Yeah.
So you mentioned Wikipedia. One thing Wikipedia does is there's detailed history, at least by month, maybe more granular even, of page view statistics and image view statistics. So we know how much people are looking at articles and how that changes over time. And so, for example, museums and other people that donate content to us really like to see those stats so they know how much the stuff they're donating is being used. So, I don't know, is there a directory somewhere where people can submit their apps to be listed as an open data app?
Open Data App Store.
That's a good question. Yeah. Or aggregating the sort of not just apps, but how many people are going to your website or
I was just going to say, if we're going to talk about like apps that need to be grouped together beyond just simple lists, there is the possibility to create your own markets. There's F-Droid. I have it installed on my Android. It only allows submission of apps that are free and open source software. It's not super blockbuster in the sense that it has every app available, but it's a start. So just food for thought.
With that, thank you all. Enjoy the conversation.